Welcome to the final episode of the Ben Shapiro election special. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here with you the last 3 Sundays, and we are truly grateful for your viewership. We've got a huge show lined up for you tonight. A great panel, a debate with Richard Fowler, and a closer look at the left's absolute panic over Kanye West's White House visit. But we begin tonight with something we call the big takedown, the Democratic Party's embrace of the mob. Last week, President Trump roiled Democrats when he rightly pointed out that the Democratic Party has endorsed the politics of the mob.
Democrats have become totally unhinged. They've gone crazy. You don't hand matches to an arsonist, and you don't give power to an angry left-wing mob.
President Trump was right, of course. The Democrats have embraced the politics of the mob. We've seen leftist mobs try to break through the doors of the Supreme Court. Good luck with that. Those doors weigh 13 tons. We've also seen protesters accosting senators and screaming at them.
Why aren't you brave enough to talk to us and exchange it with us? Don't you wave your hand at me.
Such pleasant folks. We've seen mobs try to drive Republican senators out of restaurants.
We believe survivors. Beto is way harder than you do. We believe survivors.
And over the past few months, we've actually seen Democrats openly encourage such tactics.
These members of his cabinet who remain and try to defend him, they're not going to be able to go to a restaurant. They're not going to be able to stop at a gas station. They're not going to be able to shop at a department store. The people are going to turn on them. They're going to protest. They're going to absolutely harass them until they decide that they're going to tell the president, no, I can't hang with you.
This week alone, we saw endorsement of such tactics from Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, who said that hounding public officials was fine because of white supremacy or something.
When you look at white supremacists and all of that, this is what's coming forth in our country. There's a tremendous divisiveness in our country, but this is the kind of activism that occurs, and people make their own decisions.
Former Attorney General Eric Holder emerged from the woodwork to explain that the new politics of the Democratic Party is to actually kick Republicans when they go low.
But Michelle says that, you know, when they go low, we go high. No. When they go low, we kick them.
And, of course, we saw Hillary Clinton, who, thank God, is still not president, state that civility with Republicans is completely out of the question.
You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about. That's why I believe if we are fortunate enough to win back the House and/or the Senate, that's when civility can start again.
Now, many in the media, particularly over at CNN, made excuses for both this incendiary rhetoric and for the mob itself. In a peculiar form of gaslighting, Brooke Baldwin of CNN suggested that mobs in Washington, D.C. weren't really mobs. The only true mobs are Republican mobs.
A mob is what we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, 2 Augusts ago.
No,
a mob is not what we saw chasing. I'm not saying what they did was right.
What about the people who were at the Supreme Court banging on the walls? What do you call that? Civil protest? Or is that a mob?
So much journalisming from CNN. Don Lemon on CNN, he said the same thing. He said that people who harass people at restaurants aren't mobs. Those are just, angry people.
Is it mob behavior? No, it's not mob behavior.
Yes,
it's people who are upset and they're angry with the way the country is going.
And, of course, Jim Acosta of CNN. And, folks, find you someone who loves you, like Jim Acosta loves Jim Acosta. Tried to blame President Trump for the Democrats' mob strategy.
Have you been to a Trump rally? I mean, you do hear rhetoric at those rallies that would conjure up images of a mob. Perhaps the president knows what mob rule and mob tactics look like because he encourages them himself.
The media's attempts to cover for Democratic mobs are nothing new, and neither are Democratic embraces of the mob. The truth is that this strategy, emboldening political mobs in order to strengthen political power, has been a mainstay among Democrats for generations. In the 1960s, Democrats across the country engaged in what author Fred Siegel calls riot ideology, the belief that riots were a reflection of deep underlying social ills that could only be cured by more government. Demagogues like Marion Barry, who would later become mayor of Washington, D.C., fully embraced this logic. He said of the Black Panthers, quote, "I know for a fact that white people get scared of the Panthers, and they might look at somebody a little more moderate and say, well, let's give them a little money." New York City Mayor John Lindsay said that mass unrest could be the spur to more leftist policies, explaining, quote, "Our experience is that some good can come of confrontation politics." The left fully embraced the Occupy Wall Street movement, despite its routine violation of law. That movement supposedly represented the best American politics had to offer. Jay Carney, Obama's White House press secretary, said of Occupy that, quote, "One man's mob is another man's democracy." President Obama himself expressed sympathy for rioters in cities ranging from Baltimore to Ferguson.
On the other hand, those who are only interested in focusing on the violence and just want the problem to go away need to recognize that we do have work to do here. And we shouldn't try to paper it over. Whenever we do that, the anger may momentarily subside, but over time it builds up, and America isn't everything that it could be.
In fact, President Obama wasn't afraid to use the mob as a catalyst for his policy preferences. In 2009, he infamously told bank CEOs that they'd better cave to his policy demands because, quote, "My administration is the only thing between you and the pitchforks." And President Obama was not afraid to use his own charged language to channel anger for political purposes. You remember this one? If they bring a knife to the fight, we bring a gun? Or do you remember when President Obama told people to, quote, "argue with their neighbors, get in their face"? Obama's White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Jim Messina, he told Democrats to, quote, "punch back twice as hard." And, of course, much of the left has come out to support Antifa, like, for example, CNN's objective reporter, Chris Cuomo.
But fighting hate is right. And in a clash between hate and those who oppose it are on the side of right. People who show up to fight against bigots are not to be judged the same as the bigots, even if they do resort to the same kinds of petty violence.
In fact, a favorite tactic of the modern left is to allow mob violence on college campuses, then claim that conservative speakers like me can't come to campus thanks to the threat of mob violence. That's what happened when I tried to speak at DePaul University in Chicago last year, where security threatened to arrest me for showing up after students suggested that things might get violent.
Just to be clear, if I attempt to enter that hall right there and sit down just to listen to somebody speak, or if I attempt to ask a question or to engage in free speech, you will have me arrested.
At this point, yes, sir.
Okay. It's quite odd how the supposedly unbiased media seems so unwilling to call out Democratic mob politics, but so eager to label conservatives violent. Democrats certainly had no problem panicking over President Trump's violent rhetoric in 2016. And Democrats have even been willing to slander nonviolent conservatives. They routinely called Tea Partiers members of a mob, or even terrorists. Here's Jimmy Hoffa Jr. introducing President Obama at an event in 2011 and going after the Tea Party.
Let's take these son of a out and give America back to America where we belong. Thank you very much.
When I spoke at Berkeley, hundreds of protesters, some of whom got violent and were arrested, chanted that my speech was itself a form of violence. So that's the leftist logic. Everything conservatives do is violent and aggressive, but nothing Democrats do is. And herein lies the point. For Democrats, every available avenue of resistance against Republicans is justified. Riots aren't riots. They're uprisings. Mobs aren't mobs. Those are just angry people. According to the media and the political left, but I repeat myself, Republicans are evil, so even their speech is violence. Democrats are good, so even their violence is speech. The Democratic embrace of mob politics is ugly, but it may be just the reminder Americans need that handing power to a group of people who cheer on the mob while attacking individual rights would be a terrible, terrible mistake. That's tonight's Big Takedown. Coming up, we're going to take a deeper look at the left's utter panic over Kanye West's White House visit. Thanks for watching the Ben Shapiro Election Special.
I am Todd Pyro. The government of Saudi Arabia vowing to retaliate with, quote, greater action if President Trump sanctions the country for the possible murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. This threat coming just days after the president warned of severe punishment if it's determined that the Saudi government was in fact behind the journalist's disappearance. Khashoggi disappeared nearly 2 weeks ago after entering the Saudi consulate in Turkey. And 25 people taken to the hospital, 5 of them in serious condition after a pileup accident on Interstate 405 in Los Angeles. The crash involving a white charter bus and at least 2 other cars shut down all lanes on the highway for about an hour and a half and backed up traffic for miles. California State Police are now investigating the cause. I'm Todd Pyro. Now back to the Ben Shapiro Election Special.
Well, back to Kanye West and the left's mob tactics. Here to debate, radio talk show host and Fox News contributor Richard Fowler. Richard, thanks so much for stopping by.
Good to be here.
Let's start with Kanye because Kanye is more fun. So, what was your take on Kanye? And more importantly, how do you respond to the media's response to Kanye? Because you saw some pretty over-the-top statements from folks like Don Lemon suggesting his mom would be embarrassed of him. You saw.
So listen, I tried to before I ignored the media's comments and I watched it a couple times. I watched it numerous times and I tried to. I mean, it was at best stream of consciousness, at worst incoherent. Depending upon who watched it, what view you took. I took some pull quotes. My favorite of the pull quotes was this one: "We don't have reparations, but we have the 13th Amendment." Quote Kanye West. And it was an interesting quote for me because I think where it is, and it's a very interesting turn of events for conservatives because they are now in the seat where they're defending Kanye West. And when you think about it, his policies are not really aligned with where the president is because I don't think the president or Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell or even you for that matter are rushing out to pass a reparations bill to give African Americans 40 acres and a mule. And I don't think that there's even a commitment to change the 13th Amendment so we can end prisons or imprisoning people. So where Kanye is very different from where the president of the Republican Party is, but now conservatives are defending Kanye.
Well, I think mostly what we're defending Kanye on, and I've always said, live by the Kanye, die by the Kanye. But what I've said about Kanye is that what I think is important is that he's at least expressing that he wants to think as an individual, and he doesn't feel like being boxed in by identity politics. And this is why I'm asking the media question, because what you do see from a bunch of members of the media over the last several days has been this attempt to basically say that Kanye is some sort of race traitor, that Kanye has done something deeply wrong to betray people. Do you believe that? Or
no, I mean, listen, Kanye's entitled to his opinions. I just believe that you have to be very responsible when you make those opinions, right? Because you do have an audience, and it's your job to be very educated about the opinions that you do make.
I tend to agree, but he's a celebrity, right? Is this a new rule for Kanye, or does it also hold for celebrities?
I think that rule applies to every celebrity. So when you go walk into
Milano, maybe?
Yeah, when you walk into the Oval Office and you say that you believe that people who are innocent or people who are convicted of wrongfully or people who are convicted of drug crime should be set free, that's one thing. But then to go in there and say, I believe you should release Larry Hoover, one of the most notorious gangsters in America who's in the Supermax next to the Unabomber, that's indeed problematic, and so education is important. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, race aside, I have a problem with releasing Larry Hoover back into the streets of America.
So do I, but I think that the real question here is the double standard when it comes to celebrity from the left. But let's talk about the mob politics point, because that's the other narrative this week, was the President Trump pushing the idea that the Democrats have embraced mob politics. Is that overstating the case, or do you think that on a lot of sides these days, the rhetoric is overheated?
Well, listen, I think we live in a tribalist society. I think if you were to take this, if you were to rewind the tapes, right, what Republicans are saying, what conservatives are saying, Democrats are saying in 2010 during the health care debate, or even during the government shutdown, when we saw folks rip down the metal barricades in front of the World War II memorial. We are currently in a tribalist society where you have both sides yelling at each other. And would you talk in 24 days from now?
Do you really think there's an equation between like the Tea Party and what we just saw outside the Supreme Court or in the Senate building?
I think what you see is you see tribalism on both sides. You see people saying this is what we want, we're going to yell until we get it.
But is one side kind of acting?
But wait a minute, let me finish my point. The point I'm trying to make here is that in this tribalism, what the American people are truly asking, they're not asking for people to be relatable, they're asking for representation. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, while we're both yelling at each other, 20 veterans committed suicide today. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, both in rural and urban communities, people don't have access to health care, and they want answers to those problems, and that's what this election's about.
There we can agree, and I think that we can all agree that civility would probably be a better solution than what we've been seeing. Well, Richard, thanks so much for stopping by. Coming up, our rundown panel joins us, and we'll churn through this week's hottest issues. Welcome back to the final episode of the Ben Shapiro Election Special. Tonight, we dig into the left's despicable response to Kanye West's visit to the White House. Now, I'm no Kanye West fan. Like, really. I've never been a fan of rap, and when Kanye first came out for President Trump, I tweeted, quote, "Live by the Kanye, die by the Kanye." I also have a general rule when it comes to celebrities talking about politics. I don't care. Still, Kanye West has just as much legitimacy as any other celebrity in the political space. And the same people in the media who have held up Alyssa Milano as an authority on Supreme Court nominations are now savaging Kanye for having the temerity to wear a MAGA hat. Here's what Kanye had to say.
There was something about when I put this hat on, it made me feel like Superman. You made a Superman. That's my favorite superhero. And you made a Superman cape for me also as a guy that looks up to you, looks up to Ralph Lauren, looks up to American industry guys.
It's just delicious. But the media reacted with utter shock and horror. Here, for example, is the reaction of MSNBC's Ali Velshi and Stephanie Ruhle to Kanye's Oval Office appearance.
Wow. Okay, I'm doing this for everybody who's watching us who turned their volume down. You can put it back up again. That
but
was
if you think you're
bonkers.
going to get a thoughtful play-by-play and political analysis, you're not, because that was an assault on our White House.
Jim Acosta of CNN was utterly appalled that Kanye cursed in the Oval Office, tweeting, quote, "Kanye just said mother bleeper in the Oval Office per White House pool." Members of the media are so angry about Kanye in the White House, they might also be angry if, say, Snoop Dogg went to the White House and smoked pot there. Oh, wait, he says he did when Barack Obama was president.
When you went, was it a better experience, or were you like, oh man, I shouldn't have toked it up?
No, it was an awesome experience. It's one for the ages, and I can't wait for him to, come out of the office so we can talk about what really went down.
Or maybe the media might be upset if Jay-Z and Beyonce took over the Situation Room. Oh, wait, they did when Barack Obama was president. Or maybe they'd be enraged if Common, a rapper whose lyrics had glorified terrorist Assata Shakur, went to the White House. Oh, wait, he did when Barack Obama was president. Now, I'm pretty consistent on this. I don't like celebrity politics, no matter which side it comes from. But here's the truth. Folks in the media are only angry at Kanye. They are angry beyond belief that West has bucked the Hollywood status quo. That status quo says that people in Hollywood are not allowed to be conservative, let alone Republican, let alone Trump supporters. If you voted for Trump in Hollywood, you are an outcast. You're seen as an emissary of evil. And if you are a black celebrity who backs Trump, that's even worse. Then you're basically Satan. Kanye checks the boxes on both counts. He's one of the biggest celebrities on planet Earth, and he's a black man. That means he's a traitor to both his race and to his industry, according to the media. How else can we explain the level of absolute vicious outrage from the left over Kanye's willingness to reach out to Trump, who, by the way, has already reached back out to Kanye by pardoning Alice Marie Johnson, and now wants to reach out even more with criminal justice reform? Just listen to former Democratic National Committee Chairwoman Donna Brazile, who tweeted that Kanye had set black Americans back 155 years, all the way back to 1863, when slavery was still in force. Yes, a black man visiting the White House to express his own perspective somehow set blacks all the way back to slavery. What a disgusting, nasty, vile comment, and it gets even worse. Here is Objective CNN host Don Lemon invoking Kanye's dead mom in order to shame him.
This was an embarrassment. Kanye's mother is rolling over in her grave.
Just gross. Or check out this panel from CNN, in which several contributors slam Kanye as mentally ill and ignorant, and Don Lemon laughed along.
Kanye West is what happens when Negroes don't read. And we have this now, and now Donald Trump is going to use it and pervert it, and he's going to have somebody who can stand with him and take pictures.
That right there, that's called blatant racism. Kanye isn't legitimately black because of his viewpoint, apparently. He's obviously crazy, too. This is identity politics at its finest. Kanye can't think differently because Kanye is of a particular race. All of this fits into a broader view, held by many on the left, that America is now divided between white folks and minority folks, and that minority folks believe woke social justice warrior dogma. In fact, if they don't, they're race traitors. There's only one problem for the left. That is simply not true. A new study titled Hidden Tribes from 4 academics investigated how Americans feel about political correctness. And the study found that Americans hate political correctness, regardless of age, race, or income. Americans are not interested in the left's brand of groupthink. Fully 80% of Americans believe political correctness is a problem, including 82% of Asians, 87% of Hispanics, 88% of Native Americans, and 3/4 of Black Americans. In fact, the only group of people who still believe in political correctness are far-left progressives. And, hilariously, as the study suggests, those progressives are disproportionately white and rich. Leftists want to tell everybody else what to think, but Americans think for themselves. Kanye West says he freed his mind of what he calls self-victimization. He's urged people to think for themselves. He should certainly be applauded for that. Those who aren't applauding, the people who say Kanye West should be torn apart for acting like an individual rather than collapsing to the tyranny of intersectionality, they're just demonstrating how intolerant they are. And here's the problem for Democrats and their media allies. More and more Americans know it. Americans of all colors agree that the politically correct identity politics of the left, those politics are purely toxic. No wonder the left is so scared of Kanye and so scared of anyone who thinks outside the box. Coming up, Fox News contributor Richard Fowler stops by to battle it out over Kanye and the left's embrace of the mob. You're not going to want to miss it. And we're back with Sean, Amanda, and Emily for our rundown panel. And we go through every topic, takes about 90 seconds. So let's get to the next topic. There's a new study that was out from 4 academics. The Atlantic did a big article about it, about political correctness, suggesting that it's not just white people who don't like political correctness. In fact, 80% of all Americans don't like political correctness, including 3/4 of black folks and 88% of Native Americans. Sean, is this an opening for Republicans, or is everybody just using a different definition of political correctness here?
There's probably some degree of people are just using a different definition of political correctness. But I think it's useful to distinguish. There's an element to political correctness that is just like, don't be a jerk, right? That I think there's broad agreement on. It's when it becomes dogmatic and shuts down conversation that I think people have this reaction of not liking it. And like you said, it cuts across the board.
Well, Emily, you actually did this story, so
Right.
what's your breakdown
I
here?
don't think that Republicans will be able to capitalize on this at all. And that's because the researchers admitted that nobody that they spoke to had an exact definition of political correctness. So they could all say, you know what, I'm really afraid about being a jerk to my fellow American, but I can't really say this is exactly what I should be avoiding. So it's going to be hard to create a unified message unless there's a unified definition of political correctness.
I think there is a unified definition of woke social justice progressive, though. And that was the part of the study that was fascinating to me, was that every other group doesn't like political correctness. The woke social justice progressives do, and they're almost entirely white and rich.
Yes.
Which sort of gives the lie to all of this.
If you have a hate has no home here sign on your lawn, you are most likely rich, white, and highly educated.
So, Amanda, what do you think that that's something for Republicans to build on, or are they basically?
Sure. I mean, this kind of thing goes hand in hand with identity politics, and we've seen, this heightening of political correctness, and we've seen liberals leave the left in droves. So I think like Republicans can capitalize on this because you can only for so long bash people for being racist and sexist and whatever before they start fighting back and they're told not to talk.
Next topic. So this is the most undercovered story, I thought, of the week. There was a Google internal document that was leaked to Breitbart News this week, and it showed that the media giant actually wants to move toward a more European view of free speech. Do you think Americans should be scared of that, or is this just a move by social media that's sort of inevitable? What do you make of it?
I mean,
Amanda?
this is terrifying. I mean, this is the new public square, and if we're going to have these people, we're going to have the people who cried and wept openly when Donald Trump won the election, tell us what is, quote, gender bigotry and what is acceptable speech. I mean, it's really scary stuff. I mean, it's on par with a government overreaching because they control so much. This is a very terrifying document.
Sean, do you see government regulation coming in this area because of this sort of stuff?
I think it's hard to get something like that through Congress, just because of how hard it is to move anything through Congress. But look, conservatives have been concerned about media bias for a very long time, and yet they've had very good years in 1994, in 2004, in 2010, 2014. So I don't think we should overstate the effect that this bias has. Conservatives have been able to get their message through, and I'm sure that'll continue.
Emily, we're on social media a lot,
Yeah.
obviously, in the business that we do. I think we've seen some of the blowback. Were you surprised by the Google document?
I wasn't surprised. It took forever for them to compile this, but I think this was the answer that they were going for all along. And especially when it comes to the European Union, they're looking at a situation in the EU where they're now going to be responsible for what people put on their platforms. And so Google wants to step back and say, we're going to go more with the EU where it's dignity over conflict and where it's, unified and quiet. And we're going to police things that are misogyny and gender bigotry.
Well, thank you all for stopping by. Coming up, our closing thought, 10 reasons you should go out and vote Republican on November 6th. Welcome to the Rundown panel. We're going to run through a series of topics in a way you haven't heard. Faster, more content. Everybody's got about 30 seconds to give their take. No topic takes longer than 90 seconds, and I will ding you if we hit the time limit or if you just get boring, because clocks don't care about your feelings. Joining me today, Real Clear Politics senior elections analyst Sean Trend, writer at the Daily Wire, Amanda Prestigiacomo, and the Daily Wire senior editor, Emily Zanotti. All right, let's play. So let's begin today with our assessment of the election, since it's now about 3 weeks away. Sean, where do you think this is going?
Well, one of the things that happened from the Kavanaugh hearing is it basically made everybody angry. We've seen Republican enthusiasm spike and Democratic enthusiasm spike. The problem that the Democrats have from this is that it means that they're probability of a 40 or 50 seat pickup is much smaller. It's now a fight over who's going to get a narrow majority. The Democrats probably have an edge, but not an overwhelming one.
Amanda, do you feel an additional surge of enthusiasm among Republicans? I know that I do, and I'm talking to Republicans these days.
100%. I mean, the Democrats were already galvanized, they're all just anti-Trump. But now, Republicans are so enthused by this Kavanaugh smear. It was pretty grotesque. It was pretty disgusting. So we have a lot of moms. Actually, there was good analysis by Ryan Grodetsky about, it was the Siena College and New York Times was looking at white working class millennials were actually tipping the scales towards Republicans in the House. So I don't not only think that we're going to pick up a few seats in the Senate, I think we're going to keep the House too, which is an ambitious.
Emily, I've been informed reliably that women are very upset and are going to vote in large numbers against Republicans.
From what I understand, we're voting in large numbers, but it looks like we're voting in large numbers for Republicans. Quite honestly, it looks like Democrats did in 2 weeks what Republicans have been trying to do in 10 years, which is unite everybody behind a single issue. And they did that with the Kavanaugh hearing.
Okay, we have to talk about Kanye. So next topic, we have to talk about Kanye because Kanye was a thing. I don't know anything about Kanye. I used to call him Ye instead of Ye because I really didn't know the difference, which I guess makes me ignorant.
Easy.
Okay, so Amanda, was this a good move by President Trump to bring Kanye into the Oval Office?
100%. I want to inject that meeting into my veins. It was incredible. He just exposed so much of the left. We literally saw a CNN panel call him a house N-word, or it was just outrageous. They're calling him a traitor to his race. You see the groupthink of the left, and you see that you cannot. If you don't toe that line, you're going to be called mentally ill, for instance, which is insane. I don't remember the media calling Kanye West when he said George W. Bush doesn't care about black people. I don't remember them calling him, a traitor to his race or mentally ill then. So this exposes the left so much.
And Emily, I know that you also are a Kanye West fan, so your words here are valuable.
Okay, good. I think Kanye West was the right move for President Trump. Honestly, I think we had 8 years where Obama brought in every Hollywood celebrity under the sun. They spoke to people. They spoke to people who don't particularly get involved in politics. And Kanye said it himself. It wasn't that he was on the outside. It was that he was on the outside of what everyone else was thinking. And hey, if Kanye can get it done, then more power to him.
Well, this is the question. So, Sean, neither you nor I know anything about Kanye West, is my impression. But with that said, there's been a lot of talk about Republicans making significant gains in the black community. Do you see any of that reflected in the polling?
Not significant gains, but if you look at younger African Americans, they're not as clearly Democratic as the older generation. Personally, I just look at the Kanye thing and I think it's proof we live on the weirdest possible timeline. The best. But look, if the Republicans are going to do outreach, if they're going to make improvements in the African American community, this is the type of thing that they need. They need some representation.
Okay, so next topic. The Democrats have obviously been embracing increasingly mob-like language, from Maxine Waters to Hillary Clinton saying civility is over. Emily, is their mob language going too far, or is this the new politics? Should we just get used to this?
I think this is just the new politics. I mean, it's certainly going too far. I think they've taken what Trump did during the 2016 elections and they've gone in an entirely different direction. You have Hillary Clinton acting like Emperor Palpatine, like, let the hate flow through, right? But really what's happening is I think Democrats have this symbiotic relationship with the media that typically flats back on conservatives, but in this case, they're believing their own hype, and they're coming back to themselves and saying, we need to double down on this particular strategy, which is essentially scratching at the doors of the Supreme Court like a bunch of outraged zoo animals.
Sean, what are you seeing in terms of the reaction from the populace to this? Do you think this is a line of attack that's going to work for Republicans?
You know, I think it does energize the base, and this close to an election, it's a good thing. I also agree that there's this kind of Me Too aspect of trying that's the wrong term, but trying to do what Trump did, and Trump was unique. I mean, his stick kind of worked for him. I don't think it generalizes.
Yeah, how about you, Amanda? Where are you on this?
No, Trump is, in his own element, in his own singularity. Nobody can be Trump, and we see these Democrats trying to be Trump. I mean, from Nancy Pelosi to Cory Booker to Hillary Clinton. I mean, the list goes on. Maxine Water, this new beauty, Mazie Hirono. I mean, they're all justifying all of this violence. I mean, we've seen a spate of these incidents. John Nolte at Breitbart had 600 incidents against Trump supporters since the election. 600.
It's pretty amazing. Well, we will be right back with more from our awesome panel. Stay tuned.
Then it would be okay. Occasionally you'd get an egotistical leader that would feel like, oh, you're stepping on my toes, and they'd try and put him down, and that would be problematic. But you'd see a good, solid leader anywhere in that SEAL platoon would make those SEAL platoons perform great. And if you had a bad leader in a SEAL platoon, you'd watch the whole platoon fall apart if no one stepped up and took charge and made things happen. This was very evident, and that's another thing that just solidified the principles that it's the same principles that we teach to businesses are literally the exact same principles that we wrote about in Extreme Ownership, are the same principles that we taught to the young SEAL leaders coming up.
Well, I'm going to ask you in a second, what are some of those leadership principles? And we'll actually get into the sort of nitty gritty from the 30,000-foot level. But first, let's talk about your impending death. So, life insurance, very important, but 1/3 of people don't have it. And that's because it's kind of hard to buy. You have to work out what you need and then do the research to find the best quote. And hopefully you don't get swindled along the way. It's not really a good way to shop for anything. So Policy Genius has made the whole process a lot simpler. Policy Genius compares quotes from the top life insurance companies to find the best policy for you. It takes just 2 minutes to get a quote. And if you don't know the first thing about insurance, they've got all the tools to get you up to speed. Learn the difference between term and whole life insurance, calculate how much coverage you need, and be sure you're making the right decision. In fact, over 4 million people have used Policy Genius to shop for insurance. How prevalent, how good is it? I can tell you, I had a listener who came up to me. He's in the life insurance industry. He said, I want you to stop reading ads for Policy Genius because they're putting us out of business. That's how good they are at this. Policy Genius doesn't just make life insurance easy. They also compare disability insurance, home insurance, auto insurance. If you care about it, they can cover it. So whether you know a lot about life insurance or nothing at all, start your search at policygenius.com because you're going to plot. And when you do, you want to make sure that your family's taken care of. In just 2 minutes, you can compare quotes, make an informed decision for you and your loved ones. Policy Genius is the easy way to compare and buy life insurance. Go check it out right now at policygenius.com. Okay, so now, Jocko, let's get down to some of the main lessons of leadership. So what's the number one thing you look for in a leader?
Well, the first book was called Extreme Ownership. And what that means is you're not going to make any excuses. You're not going to blame anyone else. You're going to take ownership of whatever happens. And when something goes wrong, instead of pointing fingers and blaming someone else, you're going to take ownership of that problem. You're going to take ownership of figuring out what the solution to that problem is, and you're going to take ownership of implementing that solution. So that is the number one thing that I'm looking for a leader to do, is to take ownership of the problems. And again, we called that extreme ownership. And it was one of those things that was very easy to see in a SEAL platoon, because when someone doesn't take ownership and starts pointing fingers and blaming, well, like for instance, right now, if I started pointing my finger and blaming you for something, what's your natural reaction going to be?
You get defensive, get upset. I mean, it's not my fault this broadcast isn't what I wanted it to be.
Exactly. And then what happens is we have a team where I'm pointing the finger at you, you're pointing the finger at someone else, and now we have no one taking ownership of the problems, and therefore the problems never get solved. The opposite of that is when you have a good leader that steps up and says, hey, Ben, you know what? This broadcast didn't go the way I wanted it to. I should have done a better job preparing for your questions. I'm sorry, I apologize. And now instead of you getting defensive, you say, you know what? No, actually, I could have done a better job. And now both of us are taking ownership of the problems, and we're going to get them solved. So that's kind of the number one characteristic, is someone that has the humility. Because it hurts. It stings. When something goes wrong and you're a leader and you say, oh, you know what? All this was bad situation. It's my fault. I'll take ownership of it. that hurts. That stings the ego. So you have to be humble in order to do that.
How much of leadership it sounds like a lot of it is just being a good person interpersonally, because it sounds like you can take that same message and apply it to marriage, where it's not really a question of you leading your spouse, but if you start blaming your spouse, the whole thing falls apart nearly immediately. Whereas if you have no expectations of your spouse and it's just you're going to take responsibility for whatever happens, then your marriage goes a lot better.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And we definitely, as soon as the first book came out, we got all kinds of feedback from people in every type of scenario, that when they started taking ownership of their relationship with their wives, with their spouses, it gets better. And obviously, this translates to personal responsibility. Because when you're walking around and you're saying, "Oh, it's my family, and it's the market, or it's the way I was raised, and these are the things that are holding me back," and all you're doing is blaming everyone else, you don't take ownership of those problems, and that's going to be problematic. The best thing to say is, "Okay, look, whatever happened, happened. I'm going to take control of what I can. I'm going to go forth and conquer."
So with regard to the future of the country, I mean, obviously, my mind jumps politically, and I think that we're living in an era where there's a lot of political capital to be gained by politicians particularly in telling people that they are victims and that their first move ought to be to blame the system or blame factors outside their control. It seems like you're arguing exactly the opposite. If you actually want to have a happy life, then maybe you first ought to start taking responsibility for the decisions that are within your purview. If you were speaking to people politically, what would you be telling people along these lines?
Yeah, that's 100% right. I mean, if you're blaming everyone else, I can't control you. I can't control these other things outside. I can't control. The only thing I can control is me. So instead of worrying about who else is causing you problems, worry about what you can do to yourself to improve your station. And if you go down that path, you're going to find you have a lot more control than you think you do.
So how do you deal with situations in which it really is the person's fault, right? So you're taking responsibility for everything, but at the same time, you just have somebody who's screwed up in a serious way. I just read an editorial or an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a guy who was chewed out at one point by Steve Jobs. He's working at Apple, and Steve Jobs approaches him, obviously the quote-unquote ultimate leader in the tech sector, and he just looked at what the guy was doing and he said, "This is garbage," and then he just walked away. And the guy said, "Well, it made me feel bad at the time, but I realized that sometimes it encouraged me to do better." Well, what do you think of that sort of leadership style? Are there times where you just have to choose somebody out, and is that ever useful?
There are very few occasions, because I'll tell you, from a leadership perspective, if you're working for me and you screw something up, whose fault is that?
I mean, presumably it's your fault for hiring me.
Well, number one, why did I hire you if you can't do the job? But even if, let's say I did hire you, did I give you the right guidance? Did I give you the right support? Did I actually check back in with you and make sure that you had the resources that you needed to get the thing done? Did I make sure that you were trained properly? I mean, there's all these things that I look back at myself and say, if my subordinates aren't doing what I need them to do, that is my fault. Now, to your question, do you occasionally get someone that is either incapable of doing the job for whatever reason? They don't have the cognitive capacity, or they don't have the physical capacity, or they don't have the right attitude to get a job done. Does that happen sometimes? Yes, it absolutely does. We talked about that in the new book. We had, my task unit is called Task Unit Bruiser. And we had 2 guys inside of Task Unit Bruiser that when we went through our pre-deployment training, they didn't cut it. And look, we did everything we could to mentor, to train them, to get them up to speed. But ultimately, you get to a point as a leader where you recognize this person they're just not capable of doing the job. And I'm putting all my resources into this one individual. And I'm now starting to shun the rest of the team because I'm focused on one person. So I'm actually hurting the rest of the team. So even though I have loyalty and I take ownership of the subordinates that are working for me, at some point, my loyalty to the team will trump my loyalty to one individual. And I have to make a hard decision to get rid of that person.
It's kind of a bizarre question, but my mind is going toward family situations. What do you do with kids? Like, let's say that you have several kids.
I have 4.
So you have 4 kids. And let's say that one of them is a slacker, and it's not a situation where you can just sort of cut them and fire them. The kid's stuck with it. You got to do what you got to do. How do you determine where to put your resources, given that one kid very often it requires more attention than another kid in this sort of area?
The thing with raising kids is, and again, I used to shy away from talking about this because I used to say, you know what, my kids, the results aren't in yet, right? And I don't know where they're going to end up.
Yeah.
And also, it's like, is your kid successful? Well, what does that actually mean? Because my kid could go and make a ton of money, but have a horrible family life and be miserable, right? And be a jerk, right? Is that success? No. Or they could be very happy but have no money and be living day to day, and so that's not successful either. But my kids are a little bit older now, and I can see this trajectory that they are on, and quite frankly, I'm pretty happy with the way my kids have turned out. It's a hard thing to look at because you can't fully control it. And so what are you going to do with your kids? I like to, you got to give them guidance, right? But you also have to let them brush up against the guardrails of failure. A simple example that I would say, and I probably have taken some flack for this, is I say, if you're helping your kids, you're hurting your kids. And what do I mean by that? Something as simple as tying your shoe, right? If you help your kid when they're whatever age, 2 years old, 3 years old, if you help them tie their shoe, you're actually taking away an opportunity for them to develop their fine motor skills. That's really happening at that moment. So if you do that, if you cook them every meal, if you don't let them, get their cereal bowl out, and guess what? They're going to spill milk sometimes, and they're going to knock over the cereal. And at the same time, they're developing skills that are going to help them fend for themselves in the world. So what you have to do is you have to let them brush up against the guardrails of failure from time to time. Now, where it becomes challenging as a parent, and thank God I haven't faced anything like this, sometimes your kids will take turns that will ruin their life, right? That will ruin their life. And, obviously, I'm not going to let one of my kids ruin their lives. That being said, if people take a really hard turn and do things that are completely against the parameters that you believe in, and you continue to support them, they're going to continue to take advantage of you. And so I've seen that happen with parents where kids go down the wrong direction. Like I said, I can't even imagine the catch-22 that you get in that situation where, if your kid becomes a drug addict and you want nothing more than to help them, but every time you give them the support that you think is going to help them, you're actually just enabling them. And so again, I'm no expert. What I try and do is put a box around the kids, let them develop, let them grow, and put the guardrails out there. Let them know when they disappoint you. But the other part of this is, and this is another hard thing for people to understand, it was definitely hard for me to understand, your kids aren't going to be who you want them to be. They're going to be who they are. And in my opinion, the more you force them to try and be what it is you want them to be, the harder the pushback is going to be, and you can end up with some really horrible situations.
Okay, so we talked about taking extreme responsibility. What are some of the other attributes of leaders that you look for?
Well, humility is obviously the big one. You got to be humble. If you're not humble, then that's going to be problematic. Now, what's interesting, new book that just came out is Dichotomy of Leadership. And what does that mean? That means that as a leader, you have to be balanced, right? You have to be balanced. So let's just take humility and ego, because we're looking for people that are humble. But at the same time, you can have someone that's so humble that they lack confidence. That's bad. On the other side of that spectrum, you can have someone that's so confident that they're overconfident, their ego's big, and they don't listen to anyone else. Where do you want to be? You want to be balanced, somewhere in the middle. I talked about the fact that you need to be articulate as a leader. That's great. Can you be a leader that talks so much that people stop listening to you? The other end of the spectrum is you are a leader that doesn't say enough, and now the team doesn't know what direction they're supposed to be going in. So where do you want to be? You want to be somewhere in the middle. You want to be balanced. And so what we've seen working with, after that book, Extreme Ownership, came out, we saw leaders, the biggest problem that leaders have, because the last chapter in Extreme Ownership is called The Dichotomy of Leadership. It's talking about these points. But we didn't go deep enough. It was only one chapter. And as we continue to work with leaders, hundreds of leaders, you realize the problem that they suffer the most is they go too far in one direction or the other. So the best characteristic to have as a leader is to be balanced.
There's a certain amount of that authenticity, because how much can you train into being a leader and move yourself out of where you authentically are? So you tend to be a quiet person, and now you're trying to train yourself into being the guy who can give a rah motivational speech on the floor. Are you better off just perfecting the skills that you already have, or are you better off working on the skills that you lack?
You know, it's interesting you talk about this, the fact of just being loud, right? You said a quiet person. Being loud is a characteristic of a good leader. It absolutely is, and especially of being a combat leader. Because if you're in a combat situation and you need guys to move to that door over there and there's a machine gun fight going on, the only way you're going to do it is if you're loud enough to make that happen. You're loud enough to yell and let everyone know that. I had a guy coming through my training, really smart guy, Ivy League guy, very cerebral, quiet as a mouse. And I said to him, I said, listen, you're going to need to get loud. Like, your guys cannot hear you. You're going to need to learn to project your voice. he was, for all practical purposes, as far as I could tell, physically incapable of projecting his voice. And so as I was watching him go through these iterations, I kept saying to him, you've got to be louder. You've got to be louder. Your guys can't hear you. And I didn't think he was going to make it. And then one iteration that they're going through, I see him, he needs to get guys over to this door over here. And he grabs Billy, who is the biggest loudmouth in the platoon. And he goes, Billy, get everyone to that door over there. And Billy goes, Bill, everyone get to that door. And everyone moved. And I realized that he was smarter than me. What he figured out was he could complement an area of weakness that he had with his team. And so, yes, there's ways that you can increase your capabilities. And like I said, you can become more articulate. You can learn to simplify more. You can become more persuasive if you continue to try and talk to people. But maybe something like being loud, this guy just couldn't do it. But he was able to take his team and pull the strengths in his team together to become a better leader himself. And that's always something that a good leader will do. You hear it all the time. Surround yourself with good people. I would add to that, surround yourself with good people that complement the areas that you're weak.
So how do you get a leader who's, let's say, an 80% leader to a 95% leader? Is this somebody who is just lacking motivation, or is it somebody who requires a skill set? Like, what you have a guy and you think he's good raw material. Are there actual exercises in which you can engage to become a better leader?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the SEAL teams, what we would do is we would run guys through these really complicated training scenarios that I'm talking about. In the business world, we do role-playing with people. And I'll put you in a situation as a leader where I say, okay, I'm your worst nightmare employee. Or not even your worst nightmare. Hey, I'm that older guy that's been doing this for 25 years, and I don't want to change the way I'm doing anything. And you got to get me to change it. Let's go. Let's figure this out. And what you see is 2, 3, 4 iterations of having these hard conversations. People get better at them. That's one aspect of leadership that you can definitely get better at. We run through planning drills so people learn to simplify. We run through communication drills so people learn to simplify their message. There's all kinds of ways to go from that 80% leader to the 95, 100% leader.
When it comes to, you've been in situations, obviously in warfare situations, how much of the textbook stuff is applicable? I mean, is it just you have to live through it and then a certain natural leadership capacity takes over? Or is it that you can game out all this stuff? I mean, is it possible to really game out crisis scenarios, or is it basically do the best that you can and then you're just doing what you do?
Here's the answer to that. Combat, and this is very counterintuitive to what people might think, combat is an absolute exercise in creativity. And when you're in these situations, you have to have an open mind. You have to know the principles. You have to understand combat, but then you have to be able to take those principles and apply them modulate them and utilize them in ways that they may never have been utilized before, so that you can get the outcome that you desire. It's a very creative, focused job, and people miss that a lot. And that's why the training that I ran, we really focused on forcing the leaders to get creative to solve problems.
So let's talk a little about some of the leadership examples that we all have in common. So we have, the movies provide us tons of examples of what they see as good leaders. Who are some examples of leaders that you've seen in either everyday life or in politics? Some leaders that you see and you say, that's what a good leader looks like. Because we all have this sort of picture of a leader in our head that it's an Abraham Lincoln figure, tall person who kind of only speaks when necessary. Or the leader that comes to mind for me is what's the name of the actor in Band of Brothers?
I don't know the actor's name, but I know that he's trying to portray Dick Winters.
Dick Winters, exactly. So that's the image that a lot of folks have from pop culture. Who would be your leaders that you look to and you say these are the ones who I see as sort of the heroic leaders?
Yeah, I mean Dick Winters. That's a fantastic example. I've covered his books on my podcast because he's a leader that does every one of these little nuanced things. You can see him do it. And Band of Brothers is an amazing series that really shows the nuances of his leadership. So I think that's fantastic. One of the leaders that I always tried to emulate is a guy by the name of Colonel David Hackworth, who was one of the most decorated soldiers. He served in Korea and in Vietnam. And he wrote a book called About Face, which is about an 800-page book. And it's really not about leadership at all, overtly, but it's 100% about leadership as you read it and if you're looking for those lessons. But he was a guy that, again, he balanced all these dichotomies very effectively. He was completely revered by the people that worked for him. Most of the people that he worked for loved him and loved having him on their team. However, and this is, part of the dichotomy, he's the guy he's one of the first senior leaders in Vietnam that said, look, if we don't change the way we're fighting this war, we are not going to win. And they drummed him out of the army in a matter of months after that. And to me, it was him speaking the truth as he saw it, which I have great respect for.
So when you look at today's politics, obviously it's what I do for a living, and it feels extraordinarily chaotic. It feels like it's a war of all against all. It's sort of this Hobbesian state of nature. Do you see that as a lack of leadership, or is it that there are too many people who think they're leaders fighting with one another?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we're getting accustomed to this new world where you can get reactions on a minute-by-minute basis. And one of the best ways to get reactions from people is to make statements that are extreme. And so, again, this new book, Dichotomy Leadership, it's about balance. And right now, I would say in politics, we don't find very much balance. We find people on both sides that are leaning towards the extremes all the time, and then that gets greatly amplified by the media.
How much of leadership involves actually having a group of people who have the same common goal? Because one of the big problems that I'm seeing in our politics generally, and I think this is true, just in a fragmenting society that focuses very much on the individual. I'm an individualist. I really believe that people should have the right to do essentially what they want, so long as they're not harming anyone else. But it seems like the success of a team, whether it's a Navy SEAL team or any other team, relies on having the same common goal. How much of that can be instilled by leadership, and how much of that is just, you joined the team voluntarily, you knew what you were getting into, and can that be restored if there's a lack of goal-orientedness in the society as a whole?
You have to have some kind of common goal. You absolutely do. Now, without a common goal, you don't know where you're going. Now, where we run into trouble in a team or in the political environment we're in right now is there's different ways to get to that goal. Right? There's different ways to get to that goal. I mean, I don't think there's anyone, okay, maybe there are, but generally people want good for the world, right? There's no one that's thinking, hey, we want a dictatorship in America. There's no one no normal people are saying that, right? We all have a common goal. We want families to have good lives. We want people to be taken care of. We want you to have opportunity. We want to have a good economy, right? These are all things that are pretty standard. I don't think we're going to get fighting against that. Where we get fighting is how we're going to get there and disagreements on how we're going to get there. And then what we see is people that put a stake in the ground on their idea and don't want to listen to anyone else. And in a team environment, that's problematic. It boils down to ego, right? Hey, I'm not going to listen to your idea. I want to go with my idea. And you know what? There'll be no compromise. There'll be no compromise. We're only going to do it my way. And I would rather not execute the mission, not accomplish the mission, than not do it my way. And so when I see that, that's problematic. How do you solve it? Eventually, if you're going to move forward, you have to solve it. You have to find out what those compromises are going to be.
Yeah, and this is where I actually wonder whether that's true. Maybe I have a more pessimistic view of the country than you do actually at this point, because I do wonder whether we agree on the endpoints and we're just disagreeing about the means. I think that a lot of folks, nobody's going to come out and say, I want a dictatorship. There are a lot of folks who will say, I would like to restrict X right for this group of people because I think that right as exercised is hurting me. No due process rights for particular sets of crime. We need to shut down this particular sort of speech because this sort of speech hurts me. At a certain point, I do wonder whether we lack even the common language of goals in order to arrive at a common destination. Are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future of the country?
I'm less pessimistic than you are with that and with those type of examples, because I don't see those as fringe. And again, I don't live in the same world as you do. I'm
in the worst of the yeah. I do politics all day. It's the
You're
worst.
In a constant firefight with this stuff. In normal American, I work with businesses all over the country. And you know what? I hate to break the news to you. Most people aren't watching news 24 hours a day. Most people aren't listening to those fringe people on either side. Most people are out there working hard, trying to make a living, trying to take care of their family. That's what it's beyond the vast majority. It is the absolute vast majority of the people that I work with every day are people that want to improve their station in life. They want to help their team win. They want to do good work. They got pride in what they're doing. That's what most people, construction, manufacturing, finance, that's what these people are doing. And so the fringe people that are out screaming and yelling, they're loud and the media focuses on them. Why? Well, it's because the media wants to get people to click and hear what that crazy person has to say. Most of America, we don't click on that stuff. We don't.
What do you think civilians don't understand about the military that you wish they understood more? Very, very few Americans actually now know somebody who serves in the military or has served in the military. It used to be that a huge percentage of Americans served. Now it's like 2% of Americans serve in the military. What do you think that civilians really ought to know about how the military operates and what the military lifestyle is like?
Well, number one, I think the most important thing to understand about people in the military is that they're people. And these are people with husbands and wives. These are people with kids. These are people with goals. And they're people with emotions. And I think sometimes when you see a picture of a soldier, of a sailor, of an airman, of a Marine, you think of them as that thing, as a soldier, as a sailor, as an airman, as a Marine. And we often forget that that soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, that service member, they are a person and they have a life. And so I think that's what happens when guys come home and they don't have a new mission to focus on. They get a little bit lost and people don't know how to treat them. So I say it's real simple and straightforward. They're people. Treat them like people and give them the respect that they deserve, absolutely, because the sacrifices that they make they're not sacrifices made by a robot. They're sacrifices made by a person. And like in my case, and the families as well. You know, in my case, when I was on my last deployment to Ramadi, I left my wife at home with 3 young kids. And I knew what I was doing. I knew what my day-to-day circumstances were. My wife didn't know. My wife was at home raising kids. And by the way, going to visit my wounded guys in the hospital, going to my guys' funerals. That is an incredible sacrifice on the home front as well. So I think it's important just to remember that these are people, both the service members and their families.
That's pretty amazing. How did you meet your wife?
I met my wife I was overseas and she was overseas, and we met in church.
Pretty good place to meet.
There was beer served at this particular church. Yeah, well, we met in a bar.
She sounds like a pretty amazing person. So how did she deal with all of this, with you being overseas in the middle of a battle area?
It was hard, and I think my wife I think the key component of my wife that made her, you know, we've been married for 20-something years. I always tell her it seems like forever, but you know, we've been married for a long time through multiple deployments overseas. And I think for her, what makes her able to cope with this is that she's emotionally independent from me. She doesn't need my phone call every day to reassure her that everything's okay and that, you know, I'm coming back or whatever. She's emotionally independent. And of course, she's independent and she could handle the broken water heater and the flat tire and the whatever other problems, the sick kids. She could handle all that stuff. So she's independent in that way, but she's emotionally independent as well and didn't rely on me every day to give her the boost. She's a confident, you know, squared away woman.
So it sounds like you're obviously anti-feminist. I mean, that's as a former member of the military, it seems obviously. I mean, that's what we all assume.
Yeah.
That's just the
well,
kind of person you are.
I have 3 daughters and 1 son, and you know, my daughters are you know, I wrote a couple books about kids books called Warrior Kid, Way of the Warrior Kid, and it's about kids, instead of accepting weakness, it's about kids trying to become stronger, which to me seems like a pretty fundamental thought. But if you read a lot of kids books, and you have kids, you probably see them, there's not a lot of kid books that actually tell kids that, hey, what you want to do is you want to work hard and you want to be stronger and you want to be the best that you can be. So I did that with my kids, and I wrote these kids books for them. But yeah, my daughters are absolute warrior kids, and now they're warrior adults. But
so you bring a lot of lessons from the military to the civilian area. Have you learned anything in sort of the business area that you think would be applicable to the military? Well, what have you learned in civilian life that you think added to what you already knew from your service?
The biggest and most shocking thing that I learned about the civilian sector was that leadership is leadership, and the same problems that a company with 1,000 employees would have are literally the same problems that a SEAL platoon with 16 guys would have. And learning that and beginning to understand, it didn't take me very long at all. As soon as I was sitting down with the first CEO I ever worked with, and he started telling me the problems they were having, and I just, inside I was just chuckling, saying, you gotta be kidding me. I've seen this over and over again with a SEAL platoon. Here's what the issue is. Let's address it this way. So that was the biggest lesson learned for me, is leadership is leadership is leadership.
So you're a pretty intense dude. You're the only person I've ever had on this podcast who probably speaks as quickly as I do. So have you always been like that, or is that something that's gotten you into trouble? How was this something that you cultivated, or you were always this intensive person?
No.